Well, things aren't feeling great in the fan base, but you know what? The Jets still have a chance to right the ship with just around 10 games left. And starting off with a win against Vegas would do wonders for everyone.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Now, like I said, tonight's episode, we have got some stuff to talk about. We'll take a look at the standings. Not necessarily one last time, but, close to one last time as we're rolling into the final stretch of the season. And we'll also talk about some other stuff. But the most important thing right now is that coming up tomorrow, the Jets have a chance to try and claw back something in, the last couple of weeks with a big win against the Vegas Golden Knights, right? This Knights team has been one of Winnipeg's biggest boogeymen, and recently Vegas has kind of struggled for form. The Knights this year are not the same team that they were last year, but make no mistake, they're still a really dangerous squad. They have the ability to just not die. That's the best way I can say it is, right? You look at how they play, you look at how persistent they are. They do not go down without a fight, and it makes them one of the most annoying teams in the whole league to face, even if, relatively speaking, they're a little more mediocre than they were in previous seasons. We'll talk about how the Jets will match up against them and what I'm hoping to be some changes in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, just wanted to let you know tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more because right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, the Jets have a bit of an opportunity here, and we're not going to know how the Jets are going to line up until tomorrow when they start having practice skates and stuff, but look, the Jets really cannot go into this game against Vegas icing the same team that they did last evening, right? The Jets have to make some changes. And, I know that Bones won't because he's shown that he hasn't before, but at some point you've got to do something with the top line. We have a segment dedicated to that and talking about why things have really gone south for this team ever since the top line was reunited. But in the interim, right, you got to find a way to make it work, because if you're going to force this pairing, then, at least get them some help. Right now, Iafallo, Appleton, all these guys, they've all tried to do what, almost no one else has seemingly been able to accomplish other than Ehlers, and that's make Scheifele and Connor work together. But any success that these trios tend to have is very short-lived. And when you have a situation like that where that line is really struggling, everyone else has to then pull double duty, and it's really not great when the second line is also getting pulverized. Last game, we saw the Oilers kill the top six. It didn't matter which line you were talking about, they both got butchered. And I think, it's weird to say this, but I think Ehlers might actually be too fast for Monahan and Toffoli. I think if he was just playing with one of them and you had another faster skater as part of that line, I don't think it would be a big deal. I think it would actually work pretty okay. But because you have two much slower skaters with Ehlers, who's constantly ahead of the play, who's, doing all these own entries and stuff, I feel like he's more often than not waiting too long, and that gets him into trouble, right? You want him to kind of do that tiki-taka, Barcelona style of hockey, where you're doing lots of quick passes. He's flying through the zone, and everyone's already in position waiting for his pass or his deflection or something to come to them. And that's where, that line so far hasn't really worked. There are games against slower opponents where it's not a big deal, but I think against teams like Edmonton or Dallas or top squads where you're going to face a lot of speed and skill, that's where the Jets probably need to think about shuffling that lineup because, unfortunately, Winnipeg just doesn't seem to have the right line combos to put it in the right state of mind. And I think, with how the Jets have played and how they've been getting outplayed by better, faster teams that have more skill, it's a tough one. But at least in the interim, right, the Jets do have a potential opportunity against this Knights team. They're dealing with a ton of injuries. Mark Stone's out, Alex Petrangelo's out, and Aiden Hill just got injured. So, you have a chance here on home ice to exercise one of the biggest demons in all of Winnipeg Jets hockey, the Golden Knights, right? We do not beat this team. And if you want to have some kind of positive gain, if you want to show that the last couple of games you started putting at least a couple of things together, then you have got to beat this Knights team. And I know that it sounds really stupid, but I feel like if the Jets aren't able to pull this off, they risk getting into a really bad mental state. And no one's going to really be impressed if they smack up the Ottawa Senators this weekend, right? No disrespect to the Sens, but look, we're talking about two different tiers of teams right now. You've got the teams that are out of the playoffs, and you've got teams like Vegas and LA and some of these tough teams that are coming up that are going to push the Jets to their limits. And this is where you have to come out with a big statement game. You cannot allow another defeat to really taint what has been a great season overall. Now, the Knights are still dangerous, right? Even with all the injuries, they've still got Barbashev, Eichel, and Marchessault on your first line. Second line is Cotter, Stevenson, and Amadio. Your third line is Dorofiev, Carlson, and Mantha. And then your fourth line is Howden, Roy, and Kolazar. Now, comparatively speaking, that second line with Stevenson is nowhere near as effective as it is with Mark Stone. I think Stevenson tends to play really well with Stone because Stone elevates just about everyone around him. But I still think you have to be a little bit careful about their speedy, work down low, right? That's where the Jets really struggle, especially when they get caught flat-footed in front of Hellebuck. As far as the third line is concerned, obviously Mantha has been okay so far. You've got the wily veteran in Carlson, and Mantha is that big bruising presence, but in terms of how the Jets match up against this bottom six, I feel like Winnipeg should be okay. The bottom six is one of the few areas of my least concern. It's the top six where the Jets really lose all their battles, and that's been a bit of a consistent theme throughout the last several months that Winnipeg has yet to figure out. And it's really concerning because, you're heading into the playoffs and you still seemingly haven't figured out that your top line is killing you while your second line is not doing enough to get you back in it. So tough road to climb and tough hill to climb, and it's not been easy sledding. On the Knights defense, you've got Hag and Hannafin, then McNabb and Theodore, and then finally Hutton and Whitecloud. On the Jets side, I'm going to be honest, I don't really expect too many changes. Maybe Colin Miller draws in, maybe Sandberg gets back in. They have got to stop benching Sandberg because he's like one of the few players on the back end that I would say is indispensable and really should not be sitting for any reason unless he really is just out of gas and tired and not feeling well. But if he's healthy enough to play, get him minutes because this Jets defense is a lot less strong without him. So I would hope that one or two of those changes happen. I'm really begging and praying for some sort of forward shakeup because the lines right now just don't work when it comes to your most important creators and attackers. So we'll talk about, what's gone wrong for the Jets forwards, especially the top line in just a little bit. I'm sure you're probably like, oh, are we talking about this again? Yeah, we got it because it's heading into the playoffs and things are still looking not so great. But what is looking great is eBay Motors because passion, drive, and patience are things that bring home the winning trophy, but it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to deliver a top quality performance and maintain your vehicle, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or you get your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home the victory. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on this episode as we are talking about some real fun crap, in particular the underperformance of some of the recent Jets games and really the struggles of some of our top attackers. Scheifele, Connor, Ehlers to an extent. Everyone has kind of been mired in a bit of a funk. And even when Ehlers or some of these guys score, it just feels like there's an incongruency where something's not quite clicking for this team. And I want to talk about that and why it's really important for the Jets to make the most of these next 10 games and solve this, because, yeah, you can't go into the playoffs with a bad top six. But before we get into the nitty gritty there, I just wanted to ask, if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, do you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today instead, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to Locked On Sports Today, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Now back to the Jets. Obviously, Winnipeg's top line has been a source of legitimate consternation. Everyone seems to be talking about it, and, I got to be honest. Based on how Bones has sort of answered things, I kind of feel like he's starting to run out of ideas. He was asked about, the Jets' performance in their last game, and a couple of weird things sort of stuck out to me. The first thing is that he talked about the power play really struggling, which, I mean, that ain't a secret. That's been the problem for like years now, even before Bones, right? There were years where the Jets' power play was just dog crap. But with Bones and with the recent coaching staff changes, we've really not seen an improvement. In fact, the power play at times has been even worse. All you have to do is just watch the Jets on that 4-on-4 last game, and you'd probably wished you'd have just drilled your eyes out instead, right? Because that was one of the worst power plays I've ever seen, and in a critical must-score situation, the Jets didn't. In fact, they never even looked dangerous. I don't even know if they recorded more than one shot or if they even got a shot on goal during that 4 minutes. That's pretty bad. And I feel like that's just one part of it. You got a really bad PK. And so you've got all these different disparate elements. But the one thing that Bones never really seems to talk about is the top line. And he'll sort of allude to it once in a while. He talked about putting Ehlers up there to get him going, but you just don't really hear him talk about the underperformance of the top line being as big of a problem as it really is. In fact, he tends to avoid it. I don't know if anyone really asked him in the scrum the other day about the Kyle Connor thing, especially in overtime. But he doesn't really seem to hold the same standards for the top line that he does with some other lines. And if you're giving guys tough love, I'm totally cool with that. I think sometimes tough love can be helpful in the right scenarios, but the top line is seemingly immune from this, and that's a real problem because Scheifele and Connor have been pretty bad this year when they're playing together. You'll see some fancy goals here and there. You'll see a couple of plays where they look good, and there are moments where they legitimately are great together on a couple of individual shifts. But the grand scale of things, that line gets smashed almost every game, and it tends to get outplayed by a fairly significant margin. It'd be one thing if they're like break even and, maybe 50-50 in goals. I'd probably not be that concerned about it. It's more the fact that they're just getting pulverized almost every shift. And even when they do score, it's usually not enough to really upset or come back against the deficit that the Jets are probably already rocking at this point, right? And, it's really asked too much of Hellebuck and the depth units to try and carry the load. And, the second line I was hoping, would be a better scoring group. Ehlers, Toffoli, and Monahan have shown good flashes together. But like I said, stylistically, something about that trio hasn't been working for me. And I really feel like with how important Ehlers is to Connor and Scheifele looking competent, you got to put him back up there. I know it's not the most favorable situation, and I know that for both the fans and the coaching staff, they'll always look and say, oh, Ehlers is a risky player. He makes too many risky passes. But at some point, you've got to let his unpredictability and volatility be your best weapon with two guys who frankly need it. Connor and Scheifele are too predictable. They're not really punching in goals enough to upset or overturn the amount that they're giving up or balance it out. And so the Jets are just in a really weird spot where the top line's losing, the second line's losing. The only lines that seem to do well are the third and fourth lines. And even then, for all the good possession and stuff that they create, they just don't score a ton, right? They'll tip some good pucks in. They'll try and get some good opportunities on goal. But at the end of the day, that's not their job to be, your top scorers. They're your tertiary guys who try to tilt the ice and upend the opponents in favor of giving your top six easier matchups. And so far, it really hasn't worked out. And so, Going into this final postseason stretch, as we're winding down the regular season, getting ready for the playoffs, the Jets have got to solve this problem, and they've got to do it now, because the longer that this sits, it's been a whole year. It's been multiple years, if we're being honest, but in particular, it's been this whole season. They have got to get themselves back on track. And I will say, there is one sign of potential hope, and that's that Gabriel Velarde has been skating again in a regular jersey. It's just a matter of conditioning when he'll come back. My concern is that he's going to get put up on the first line, and we're going to see an even worse trio go out again. We've seen how bad that threesome is together. Unless Velarde has suddenly changed form and turned into a beautiful butterfly, that line is probably going to get killed again. And especially against teams like Vegas or Vancouver or Nashville, these guys are all fast and skilled and grindy in the corners and stuff, and they just feast on teams like the Jets that don't have a lot of foot speed. And that top line, especially with Velarde up there, is really sluggish and not very good. So, man, I'm trying to be optimistic and try and look for ways to think about this from a perspective that it's a fixable problem. But because the coaching staff seemingly doesn't want to touch this trio and address that line in a way that I think really makes sense, we're going to be stuck with this. And we just have to hope that somehow Hellebuck and the rest of the team can pull it all together and carry the Jets through. Because unless the top line chemistry changes, unless the coaching staff recognizes where the central core problem is, we're going to keep seeing this stuff over and over again. It's really sad that, once again, the Jets have an amazing roster, really one of the best rosters that they've had in years. And, the decision-making and stuff is torpedoing it. And I know, Dallas fans told us, oh, this is going to be one of those hires that you regret. But at the end of the day, I don't think I'll ever regret the bonus hire. I think the biggest thing that he was brought in to do was to help build a more positive culture. And I think he's done that. It's just when it comes to the tactical side of things, he has definitely lost touch with his team. And it feels like he doesn't have his finger on the pulse at all. There are moments where I'd actually say it resembles some of the Dave Lowry era, which if I'm saying that, it's been pretty grim. But hey, this is a coach who did manage to get the Stars to the Stanley Cup Finals. Maybe he's got some secret recipe that we're just waiting to be unleashed upon the NHL that's going to push the Jets through and get us to at least some sort of a deep playoff run. I'm not expecting much anymore. I'm barely even hoping for a first-round victory, but you know what? Maybe the Jets will silence us doubters. Maybe they'll really surprise us. I'd love to be wrong and feel like this team is unstoppable again, because let me tell you, that 17-18 playoff run, that was like the best tease ever, and we just never got it back. So I'd like to have that back again. Let's get that feeling again so that it can make a trip to Winnipeg a reality again. I really want to go back up. I really want to see some playoff hockey, and the Jets, and now it's in their court to deliver the city the deep playoff run and championship title everyone deserves. But obviously, the Jets aren't the only team fighting for, a real big playoff seed. The season's winding down, and a lot of teams are kind of fighting for, positions, playoff spots, seeding structure, all that fun stuff. We're going to dive into how the different divisions look, how the wild card race is shaping up, and some really funny developments as teams in the East are trying to chase some of the surprisingly available playoff spots, especially in the wild card. We'll get to that in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the March Madness tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Now, look, I don't know a thing about college basketball. I only know something about it. I know that there's some big upsets recently. I think UVA had a really ugly performance. I hope I said their school right. If I didn't, I apologize. I come from Maryland. I got to watch some Terps basketball, but by the time that I was watching it, it wasn't so good. So I didn't even have to worry about March Madness, but a lot of you are probably following along. A lot of you might even be casting bets. And for those of you who are interested in maybe getting in on the action, right now, new customers to FanDuel get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just wrapping up with some standings thoughts. Obviously, the league is winding down the last 10 or so games for most teams, and, Things are looking interesting. Out east, you have a very unusual race, I guess. I don't know how to describe this whole mess of a conference. Well, I guess a mess would probably be the best way to describe it. But I would say of the two divisions there, obviously the Atlantic is probably the strongest. I know it somehow doesn't have the best team in that whole conference, but it's got two pretty darn good ones, and one of them might arguably be the best. Now, you've got the Bruins, the Panthers, and the Leafs in the first three spots, which is about expected. Tampa Bay is occupying the first wildcard spot by a pretty healthy margin, so they're likely to make it. Detroit is further off, and after an overtime loss to Washington, their playoff hopes are really starting to fade. That was really a game that they could not afford to drop, and with the Caps having not only a 2-point advantage, but also a game in hand, the Red Wings might be starting to count their days, especially with the relatively mediocre performance. They're like 3-6-1 in their last 10 games, and if you're chasing a playoff spot, simply not good enough. The Devils are still clinging to a lifeline. They only have, a few games left to really try and tip the balance in their favor. 9 games is really not a lot to work with, and, trailing the Caps by 5 points, not looking ideal if you're in New Jersey. If they had goaltending at the start of the year, maybe they'd be in a playoff spot right now. But as it is, pretty grim. In the Metro Division, you've got the Rangers, the Hurricanes, and the Flyers. And seeing the Flyers in there is very funny because they actually have a negative goal differential, but it's not as funny as seeing the Capitals in the playoff spot because they're in the second wild card, and they have a minus 26 goal differential. That's one of the weirdest and wildest things you'll ever see. Usually teams in the playoffs at worst have like a -5 or a -6 goal differential. In the more fringy teams, minus 26 is crazy. Somebody anecdotally said that they just get blown out in games, but then, when they do win, it's usually by close margins. It just seems like in the games that they've been able to start to win over the past few weeks, they have managed to score timely goals. I hate saying that, but that apparently is what has happened with this team. They conceded loads earlier this year, lost many of their games, and then have seemingly rallied back behind Charlie Lindgren and an offense that has seemingly started to put 2 and 2 together. So, yeah, I guess the Caps are making the playoffs. Who knew? The rest of the teams, the Islanders, the Sabres, Penguins, Sens, Canadiens, and Blue Jackets, they're all probably thinking about next year. The Islanders do have as many games played as the Caps, but because they're, 6 points back now, their likelihood of actually being able to close that gap probably not looking so good. And I think that's the same case for most of these teams that are within reach, technically speaking. You'd have to really expect the Caps to completely implode, though, and fall out of the playoff spot for them to really have a chance, which is possible, but just not super likely. Out west, things are a lot closer, and it's not ideal for the Jets, unfortunately. In the Central, you've got Dallas, Colorado, and Winnipeg, and they've all about played the same amount of games. Their form, though, is very different. The Stars are 8-2-0, the Avs are 9-1-0, and the Jets are 4-5-1. So if you're looking for signs of optimism, you're probably not finding it. The Jets have really floundered recently. I think their record probably flatters them a bit, and for all I've said about this being a really strong season, if Winnipeg falters out of the gates and basically gets knocked out in round 1, you've probably got to count that as a failure. This team was built at the trade deadline and at the start of the season to be a lot better this year, and they were, generally speaking, but now they've fallen short. And the coaching staff, it's their job to get this team back on track. And, the team's top stars that aren't named Hellebuck or some of the other guys, they've really got to show up. You really need more from Connor. You need more from Scheifele. Honestly, you need more from Ehlers just because he's going to have to make up the difference when those guys are struggling. So I feel that that's a little unfair, but at this point, you're going to have to ask it. You're probably going to have to ask even more of Morrissey. Everyone's got to step up big time on top of the big loads that they're already carrying, because it just seems like until the top line situation's resolved, we're going to keep seeing the same stuff over and over again. The Pacific is a little bit less close, I would say. Vancouver has basically run away with the division. Then you've got the Oilers and Kings. And, it just seems like this is a pretty mid group of teams. Edmonton obviously has the potential to be really scary, and we saw how good they were against the Jets, right? But they've been kind of like so-so the last several games, comparatively speaking. But, as soon as the playoffs roll around, they might be a team to be very afraid of. The Kings are just another one of those squads that is pretty good, and they've been on a like a 4-game win streak recently. I still don't think I'd be too worried about them. the Jets have enough to worry about anyways with teams like Nashville and Vegas really holding those wild card spots. And I feel like this is a pretty safe bet that at some point the Preds are going to overtake the Jets unless Winnipeg's form really turns around. I think Winnipeg is going to find itself in a wild card spot here pretty soon, which might not be the worst situation. Unfortunately, the Jets have like one of the best records, so you'd really have to hope that the Canucks kind of win out so that you don't have to face Dallas. Because if you face Dallas or say Colorado, should they move into first in the Central, you're not going to have a great playoff run. So lots of fun things to consider there. Not feeling ideal about it. Outside of the wild card, you've got the Blues, the Wild, and the Flames and Kraken. And obviously, the Blues and the Wild are the only teams that are anywhere near in playoff touching distance. But, even for the Wild, they're like 9 points back now, which is basically insurmountable. I think they'd have to go on like a crazy historic run for that to really work. And you'd also have to hope that the Knights really fall apart. But the Blues are the team that's probably making Vegas sweat a bit. St. Louis is not good this year. They're definitely very inconsistent, and they've had some big issues. But you know what? If the Knights start to struggle down the stretch with all the injuries that they've sustained and some of their top performers going a little bit quiet recently, there is a chance. The Blues could squeak in there, pull off a big upset, and the Knights missing the playoffs, I'm sure would make a lot of people happy. It'd probably be a bit of a relief for the Jets because every time we see Vegas in the playoffs, it is just a massacre. So let's hope that, Vegas for once finally misses the postseason again. They haven't really missed too much of anything recently, but, one time here would be a huge boost and at least help us feel a little bit better about Winnipeg's playoff odds. Because even with that half-damaged, half-injured team, I would still probably think they would beat the Jets just because there's something about that team that's really got a hold on Winnipeg and apparently cursed us. But maybe y'all feel differently. Let me know what you're looking forward to over the next few weeks. Do you have any particular rooting interests that are outside of Winnipeg? Drop the teams that you are following the most just out of curiosity, or maybe you're actively rooting for them to maybe even help the Jets out. Let me know who I should be watching out for in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. But for tonight's episode, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Hopefully, I'm talking about a Jets win because Lord knows we all need it. As always, have a great night and go Jets go.